welcome to my channel. I'm Jordan, and today I've got my June wrap-up. June was a really great reading month, and I'm not even really sure how it happened, but I ended up reading 15 books and really enjoyed a lot of them. Let's see, as far as some statistics, I had 0 1-star books, I had 3 2-stars, 8 3-stars, 2 4-stars, and 2 5-stars. And the 2 5-stars were very excellent. As far as format, I read 8 books as audiobooks. So 7 of those are books that I don't own, and I just read them off of Scribd or Hoopla, and then 1 book that I do own, but I still decided to read the audio version. 4 of the books that I read, I own and read them physically, and then 3 of the books I read in ebook format. 2 of those were through NetGalley, and 1 of those was through Scribd as an ebook. So getting right into the books that I read, the first one was Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This is the classic novel. I'm sure I don't have to explain it. It's one that I've never read before, but of course I've heard about all of the retellings and all of the adaptations. I've heard many things about this book. A lot of people really love it. It's a lot of people's favorite classic, I believe. And I enjoyed it. I gave it, let's see, 3 stars. I think that it would have done me a little bit more of a service to read it in like a classroom setting or some setting where I could discuss it with other people. I don't know that I'm fully appreciating it yet for what it is and for how important it is in literature. And so I've been trying to look up like study guides and things about the book just because, you know, the story itself I might consider kind of lackluster, and of course it was very wordy and long-winded, as a lot of classics are, and I can kind of understand why it's so important and beloved, but not fully. And so I've been thinking and saying that I just want to ruminate on it a little bit more and maybe watch some of those movie adaptations and just kind of get to know the story even deeper. Overall, it was a good reading experience. I did listen to this one on audio, and I have the physical version obviously, and so I was able to kind of flip back and forth. Yeah, overall good reading experience. I don't think it's my personal new favorite classic, but it's one that I am very glad to now have read and be able to understand some of the references and things that people will say about it. The next book that I read was Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. As I mentioned in my May wrap-up, I read With the Fire on High by Elizabeth Acevedo in May and fell in love with it. It blew me out of the water. I didn't expect to love it as much as I did because it is YA, but I did love it. And then after reading that book, I knew that I had to read Acevedo's other works. And so Clap When You Land is her newest release, just came out. It is about these 2 young women, I think they're like high school age. One lives in the Dominican Republic and one lives in New York City, I think. And they one day find out that their dad was on a plane and it went down and their dad has passed away, and they realize that they are sisters. They never knew that each other existed. They never knew that their dad had like these 2 lives in these 2 different countries. And so they're not only dealing with the grief of losing their dad, but they're dealing with learning that he did have this other identity and this other life. So this was definitely a hard-hitting book. Just like With the Fire on High, I think Acevedo does a really great job of making you fall in love with the characters. Both of these girls were mature and complex and not perfect but lovable, and I really enjoyed reading their stories and would highly recommend this book. If you have read Acevedo's other books and are curious about it, definitely pick it up. It's definitely another great one by her. And if you haven't picked up anything by Elizabeth Acevedo yet, I highly recommend. She is my new favorite author right now. I also highly recommend the audiobook, Acevedo. With this book specifically, there are 2 different perspectives, so there are 2 narrators, and Acevedo is one of them. And her other books, Acevedo narrates them, and that's a really great way to experience the story too, because she is telling her own story. But I rated it 4 stars, highly recommend. The next book that I read is Slay by Brittany Morris. And if you watched my mid-year book freakout tag, you will have already heard me rave about this, but this book was incredible. This is about this girl named Kira, I think. Yeah, Kira, who has invented, developed, and now runs her own online virtual reality video game. And she is a black woman And her video game is all about Black culture, and it's for Black players to be able to experience their culture in the fullest in a virtual reality setting, and to just feel safe playing a video game surrounded by other Black players who aren't going to criticize them or call them names or demean them or judge them. And I thought this was so fun to read. First of all, the video game aspect of it is so much fun. It's so cool reading about this world that she's created. It was educational for me as a white person to read about some of those Black culture references and how some of them mean so much to this Black character. And I imagine that a Black reader would be able to connect with this on an even deeper level, and it would feel really validating to read about that. I can't say that for sure. Obviously, I'm not speaking for Black readers, so I would definitely say to look up some Own Voices reviews on this book too. But all I can say is that I really, really enjoyed this book. I didn't expect to love it as much as I did, but I know that this will already be one of my favorites of the year. And I'm very confident in saying that. So I rated this 5 stars. I have also said in my review that this did remind me a little bit of Ready Player One, which it's hard not to make that comparison because they are both video game books. Back when I read Ready Player One several years ago, I gave that one 5 stars, and I think I imagined that it'd be really hard for another video game book to kind of dethrone it as my favorite, but this one has. This one I enjoyed way more than Ready Player One. I would love to see this book in movie form, but yeah, super recommend this book if you have not heard of it or not checked it out. Definitely recommend. It's by a Black author, so obviously also from that aspect I really want to support it and recommend it to as many people as possible. So 5 stars, new favorite of the year, I already know. Read Slay. And then the next book that I read is The Poe Text by Elizabeth Acevedo. So this is the 3rd book that I've read by her. It rounded it out so that I've read all of Acevedo's books, and I think that I actually did myself a disservice by reading this book last. And that's because this is Acevedo's debut book. This is the first book that she published, and it's wonderful. It just didn't impact me quite as much as her other books. I think that she's been getting better as a writer, which is great, obviously, but when you start with, you know, her most recent books and then work backwards, I think that it just made it a little bit less impactful to me. This is a book told in verse about a Black woman who is getting into poetry, slam poetry. She's raised in a really religious household, but she's starting to question her own beliefs and kind of challenge her family on their beliefs, and it causes some turmoil. So it's definitely hard-hitting, just like all of her books are. I rated it 3 stars, highly recommend. I really want to get a physical version. I listened to this one on audiobook. I think the physical version of all of Acevedo's books are just beautiful, and so I would love to have her collection in my collection. All the things that I said about Clap and You Land and Elizabeth Acevedo as a writer still apply here. It was a really, really good reading experience. The next book that I read, switching gears, is called Why Doctors Skip Breakfast by Gregory Charlop, who is a doctor. I was sent this book. I'm in like a review Facebook group where you can request or where they're looking for reviewers, and they send you the book for free in order for an honest review. And this is specifically about intermittent fasting and different things that you can do to prolong your life. And so I was definitely interested in that. I have played around a little bit with intermittent fasting, specifically after having a baby, and, you know, kind of for the first time in my life trying to actually lose weight and looking into medical strategies to do that. And so from that perspective, I would say that this book was successful because it did provide enough evidence for me to feel like I do want to continue trying intermittent fasting. That being said, I did have a number of other critiques about this book. I think that it's a very short book, and I think it maybe tried to cover too much, and there were too many broad general statements that I've already heard before too many times. It says things like, get enough sleep, lower your stress, try meditation, which are all things that like sound great, but if you don't have some new information or some new strategies, it just kind of goes over your head. It doesn't really stick unless you have something unique to add to that advice. And I just don't think that this book had that. I also think that a book like this isn't really going to be relevant for that long of a time, especially because many times within the book he said the statement that this research is always changing, you know, this is relatively new, and especially if you're saying that within the book, it just discredits it even just a couple years into the future. This book isn't going to be relevant. I just have a number of problems with it. I think that there's enough research out there on intermittent fasting and some of the other topics in this book that you can find it yourself with Google searches and just free resources online. So I gave it 2 stars. I wouldn't recommend anybody to purchase it. I don't think that any of the information in it is bad or wrong. It just wasn't exceptionally helpful to me. The 6th book that I read is Catherine House by Elizabeth Thomas. This is a book that I've seen described as dark academia. It follows this girl, this woman, who is starting at this sort of college called Catherine House, and it's very mysterious in that there are a bunch of rules for the people who attend. You know, you have to wear certain clothes, you can't just call the outside world anytime you want. You kind of earn points and have to spend those points on specific rewards or things you want, and it's very mysterious in the different subjects you can study, and you're basically devoting your life to this school for 3 years. Where you live there full time, you study all the time. It's very rigorous, and it's just mysterious what it's all about. And this girl is attending this school, and she's kind of questioning if she really belongs there, why she was chosen to go there, and just trying to figure out what's going to happen to her. And based on that premise, I don't know about you guys, but that sounded incredible to me. It sounds super creepy and mysterious, kind of Lock Every Door vibes by Riley Sager, just because it's this mysterious living situation. But unfortunately, that novelty wore off pretty quickly, and it just became really slow and boring, and I wasn't getting enough answers quickly enough to really make me want to keep reading. I did finish it. I listened to it on audiobook, and in the end, it just wasn't for me. I ended up giving it 2 stars just because there was nothing really that gripping about it to me, and the ending was a little unsatisfying to me. I have seen good reviews for this book, and it's a new release, so definitely still look at other reviews. I think that if the dark academia type of book is up your alley, you can totally still give it a try. Maybe just go into it knowing that it's not like a heart-racing, page-turning kind of thriller. It's more of a slow burn, creepy, mysterious kind of thriller, and you might enjoy it. But I gave it 2 stars and was unfortunately a little disappointed. The next book that I read was The AntiVirginity Pact by Katie Wismer. I don't actually know how to say her name, even though she is a booktuber and an author who makes booktube videos, and that's how I heard about this book. This is her debut novel. She's also released a poetry collection and has another poetry collection coming out this year, but this is her first novel that she's released, and it is a YA novel about this high school senior who has made this pact with her best friend to lose her virginity by the end of the year. And I don't really read YA that much. I don't love just drama-filled high school stories, but I wanted to support Katie. I got this book on NetGalley, whose channel, by the way, is Kate's Book Date. I wanted to support her and read the book and just try it out, and it ended up actually surprising me and impressing me. It ended up being a little bit deeper, a little bit more complex than I was expecting, so I was pleasantly surprised by that. It was definitely a fun read. I ended up giving it 3 stars. It's nothing life-changing to me. It was a really good debut novel, and I think that you know, Katie can grow from this and improve from this, and it's not something that she'll be embarrassed about in the future, but it's something that she can grow from, which I think is a really great starting point. And I think that anybody who does read a lot of YA and who is interested in a premise like that, this might be the perfect book for them. The next book that I read was West of Sin by Wesley S. Lewis. This is a book that I had never heard of before. I was actually contacted by the author to review this book. I know there's that's like 3 review copies in a very short amount of time, but I was emailed on a whim, asked if I wanted to review this book. I said yes. It is a mystery set outside of Las Vegas, and it's basically this woman is running away from something in Vegas when she stops at a gas station kind of in the middle of nowhere and gets put into the middle of this robbery gone wrong. And it goes from there. And again, I'll be honest, that didn't quite sound like a premise that I thought would be my cup of tea, but I still decided to give it a shot and was very pleasantly surprised that I really, really enjoyed this book. It's very long, it's like almost 400 pages, and by the 150 page mark, things were happening that I thought felt like the climax of the book, so it definitely had me wondering, you know, where else can this book go? What else is this author gonna do? And it was just a lot of fun to read. I mean, it's not fun what was happening to them, but the ride it took me on was really fun, and it was suspenseful and thrilling, and it was action-packed, and again, that doesn't sound like something that I would love, but I really, really enjoyed it. And so I would recommend this to people who do like action-packed books, very plot-driven. I mean, the characters are good too, and you definitely fall in love with some of the characters in here, but it's similar to like an Ocean's 11 type book where there are heists and you know, chases and just a lot of action. So if that sounds interesting to you, I definitely recommend it. I gave it 4 stars. So even if that doesn't necessarily sound interesting to you, but if you have tastes kind of similar to mine when it comes to mystery thrillers where you want something really suspenseful and really to keep your attention, I would recommend this book. So yeah, West of Sin, a pleasant surprise. And the next book that I read was Too Late by Colleen Hoover. This is pretty different from all of Colleen Hoover's other books. I have read Verity by Colleen Hoover, which is a thriller and is actually my favorite thriller of all time. But Colleen Hoover also writes mostly romance books. And so far I've loved also all of her romances. They are very deep and emotional and hard-hitting and not just light and fluffy, which is exactly what I want in a romance. I want something that is deeper and more emotional. And this is a little bit of a cross between the two. It's a dark romance. And the way that this book was published is actually interesting too. So at the beginning of this book, Colleen Hoover wrote like a letter to the reader to kind of explain that this was a book that she never intended to actually publish. It was a project that she worked on a little bit at a time, and she would publish a couple of chapters at a time online for free, and whenever she was in like a writing slump or anything, she would just go back to this story, add a little bit to it, and then move on to something else. And eventually she ended up finishing this story, and readers were asking for it to be published as a real book so that they could have you know, the book to read. And so that's how this book was born. And so Colleen Hoover put C. Hoover as the author, just kind of to differentiate this book from her other traditionally published books. So with all that being said, it does feel different as you're reading it. You know, it's not a book where the whole thing was plotted perfectly and then written out. It was written in increments, so she kind of had to go with whatever she wrote before and just add on to it. Again, I like darker, more emotional books in general, and this was very dark. It's not my favorite Colleen Hoover book, but it's one that I don't regret reading at all. I definitely would recommend it if you're someone who wants to read all of Colleen Hoover's books. Definitely don't leave this one out. It's still good. I give it 3 stars. Some formatting things, so there's like 3 epilogues and a prologue at the end, and like all of these things that you can tell were added after the fact, and you know, maybe just kind of fan service, not something that she necessarily intended to include, but by popular demand included. And normally I don't really enjoy epilogues in books, but because of how this book was published, I understand why it was done, and I can just enjoy it and appreciate it for what it is. But yeah, this was definitely a unique reading experience. I am super glad that I read it. I gave it 3 stars, and like I said, would recommend to fans of Colleen Hoover. And then, continuing on with that theme, I also read It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. This is a romance. This is about this girl, Lily, who meets this guy, and they kind of have this whirlwind romance, and then someone from her past, it's just a bookmark, I still had it in it, someone from her past comes back into the picture and kind of threatens things she has with this guy. I know, that's all kind of vague, it doesn't really matter. It's a romance, it's emotional, it's hard-hitting. This book specifically has a lot to do with abuse, domestic abuse, physical abuse, and so heavy trigger warnings there if that's something that you're sensitive to. Definitely tread with caution, but I absolutely loved this story. I think that the characters were incredible. I mean, some of them do some pretty terrible things, but Some of them are just so lovable and you want the best for them. And it's crazy how your emotions can kind of go on a roller coaster throughout a book like this, where one minute you don't like a character, then you fall in love with them, then they do something that makes you despise them. It just takes you for such a ride. I think Colleen Hoover, like I said, she's one of my favorite authors. This just solidified that. I gave it 5 stars. Super, super highly recommend. Alright, the next book that I read is The Girl from Widow Hills by Megan Miranda. This is a book that I read on NetGalley. It was just released at the end of June. And this is a mystery thriller about a woman who is from this small town called Widow Hills, where she had actually become kind of famous because as a kid, she was a sleepwalker and ended up walking out into the street one night, and then there was a flash flood and she was pulled by the current into like the drainage system and in the underground pipes of her town, and was stuck down there for 3 days and was eventually rescued, obviously alive, and her mom ended up writing this book about her and that experience, and so she had become kind of famous for it. And so she had kind of spent her life trying to escape that story, fame following her, and then now we're following her as she had eventually moved back to that town to kind of close up some loose ends from her life. This was an average thriller to me. I give it 3 stars. I think that that's kind of how Megan Miranda is for me. I haven't had any books by her totally blow me away and become new favorite thrillers. If you like Megan Miranda books and they are some favorites of yours, this is definitely, I think, something that would be up your alley. The writing style and stuff is very easily digestible. There were a few twists that got me for sure, so it's not a bad thriller by any means. I also have kind of discovered that I don't particularly like thrillers where the main character does all of the detective work themselves. In this story in particular, it seems like the things that are happening, like, why can't you just go to the police? You know what I mean? I find myself saying that all the time, this one in particular, but just in general, I think when the main character is doing the detective work, it just becomes unbelievable to me. I can't put myself in the story because I think if I was in that situation, I would tell the police and have the professionals do the work to figure out what's going on. But that's just me. If that doesn't bother you, then I don't think this book will bother you in that way. I still have a number of Megan Miranda books on my shelves that I do plan on reading eventually, so I'm not giving up on Megan Miranda by any means. This was just another average thriller for me, so I gave it 3 stars. And then the next book that I read is a weird one. It's called Shoeless Joe by W.P. Kinsella, and this is the book that inspired the movie Field of Dreams, if you've seen that. It's a baseball book about this guy who has these kind of visions or this voice talking to him that tells him to build a baseball field in his backyard. And when he does that, then these old dead baseball players come and play on his field, and it's like his dream because he's a huge baseball fan. I only read this book because I am in a Facebook book club, and every month they put in some prompts for you to read, and it's just kind of like an added challenge to your reading, and this fulfilled the prompt this month of reading a book set in your home state or province. And I live in Iowa. Honestly, there aren't all that many options when it comes to books set in Iowa, and so this is one that I had seen the movie before, and so I thought maybe it'd be fun to read the book too. I think that it's definitely for actual fans of baseball. I mean, I didn't really get anything from this book other than some mild entertainment, but it definitely just wasn't for me. I didn't really go in expecting to love it, and I didn't come out loving it, so it was pretty average, 3 stars. I don't really have a whole lot to say about it. And the next book that I read is called Tell Me Again How a Crush Should Feel by Sarah Friesen. I'm not sure how to say that last name. But this is a YA contemporary book about our main character who is discovering her sexuality and basically learning that she likes girls and trying to navigate that while in high school. And there's this new girl who comes to her class or to her school, and she's super attractive and just different from all the other girls, and she thinks that she might like her, but she doesn't know how to approach that situation and how to tell the people around her. So it's definitely a good coming of sexuality read. It's also quite diverse. The two female characters, have a lot of discussions about their ethnicities and how other people just can't relate, or they make assumptions about their ethnicities, and it's nice to have someone else to just relate to in that way, and to be able to talk about their ethnicities openly and not get those judgments or those assumptions. And so that was really great to read about. Some of the writing was a little jarring, like the way that chapters ended was just kind of like in the middle of a conversation or in the middle of a scene. It was very different from anything I'd read. But I listened to this book on audio. It was a nice, easy read. I think it was on Scribd, so I gave it 3 stars. The next book that I finished was The Family Upstairs by Lisa Jewell. I had very few thrillers this month, which is interesting, and I'll definitely have to get more heavily into thrillers in the next few months because I've missed them. But this is the first Lisa Jewell book that I've read. I listened to it on audiobook. This one I would describe much more as a family drama than a thriller. Very slow moving, very character based, but I will say that I got confused about all of the characters, and I listened to it on audiobook, and there are multiple perspectives and there were multiple narrators in the audiobook, which is normally a good thing, but the female narrators actually sounded really similar to me and got confused in my head a lot, so I didn't always know whose perspective I was hearing. And again, there are a lot of characters, and some of our characters are even confused about who some of the characters are, so it was just a lot of confusion for me, and not fast-paced enough or not thrilling enough for me to really be invested or intrigued by the story. I ended up giving it 2 stars. Unfortunately, this doesn't make me want to rush and pick up a bunch of Lisa Jewell's other books. I know that some people really, really love Lisa Jewell, so I'm sure that I will pick up more by her, but as of now, this unfortunately kind of turned me off a little bit. And then the last book that I read is The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. This is a nonfiction book about these women who, in like the 1920s, were working as radium painters, where they would paint like navigation dials for the military when the US was in war, and they would use the radium paint to be able to make the dials glow and be easier seen by the pilots or the Navy or whoever was using these dials. And it wasn't known at this time that radium was toxic, and that these women, when they were painting the dials, they would use this radium paint, and every time they painted a dial, they would stick their paintbrush in their mouth to get it to a perfect point, and then paint. And so every time they were doing that, they were ingesting tiny amounts of radium. And so this book is all about the discovery of these women starting to have some major tragic health problems and trying to attribute it to radium, but at that time nobody knew that radium had these bad effects on people. And so the company was trying to get out of lawsuits and things when these women were coming forward with these medical issues. These women were just trying to get justice for themselves, but also for all of the women who were doing this job, who didn't realize that they were slowly poisoning themselves. And man, this was a hard read to get through. I mean, it was tragic is the only way to describe reading about these women and their experiences, and how they thought that they were so lucky to have this job because it paid well and it was fun and they got to be surrounded by their friends, and the radium they actually at that time thought was healthy for them, and so they were all excited about being, you know, covered in radium paint, and like their mouths would glow at the end of a work day because they had ingested so much radium. And then just reading about their slow decline into pain and agony and illness and bone fragility and breaking bones and getting masses growing in them, and just reading about all of that was really hard to get through. And this author's intention with this book really was to focus on the women, because I think that they had kind of been forgotten in history before this. And so she spent a lot of time describing these women and their backstories, and there are so many women that it got a little confusing and got a little sluggish just because we were reading backstory after backstory. And I understand that the intention was to make them seem like human beings, because they were, but I think that after a certain point that declines when they all just start to kind of jumble together, and they then start to to feel less like humans again, because there are so many of them. So if I'm being extra picky, you know, I thought that that was just a little long, and I would cut some of the descriptions of the women and get more into the actual meat of the story. And it was like a 500-page book or something. I read it as an ebook on Scribd. I think that a lot of the most impactful parts were right at the end, and I think that this book might lose some readers near the beginning and middle of the book just because it is so sluggish at first. And so that's my critique, is that it was long and got a little slow in parts, but overall I think that this story is an important story to be told, and so I would highly recommend it to anyone who's looking to get more information about the Radium Girls. I do think that this is a movie, and it's been a little hard for me to track down because I want to watch it, but it looks like it was released in 2018 at like festival viewings, and I think it was supposed to be released in April of 2020, but I don't know if that had been delayed or what because of, you know, COVID. Obviously a whole bunch of movie premieres have been put off, and so I haven't been able to find anywhere to watch it yet, but as soon as I can, I definitely want to watch it because I think that this would make a great movie. But the book was great. It included actual pictures of the women, both when they were healthy and doing their jobs, and then as well near the end of their lives when they were suffering. And so just a super important, impactful read. I give it 3 stars. It was a hard book to rate in general because it's not something that you enjoy reading, it's just something that you learn from. But hopefully my thoughts have come across well enough on what I thought of the book. So with that, that is all 15 books that I read in June. Super happy with that reading month. I have a little bit fewer plans in July, so I don't know if it'll be a slower reading month or what, but it'll be kind of nice to just calm down. I had a lot of ARCs and review copies and things to get through in June, and I have less of that in July, so it should be a little bit more calmer and low-key. But other than that, I don't have anything, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.